Hi, everybody. I read 2 o'clock right now. I'm just going to wait about 2 minutes to give some folks some more time to file in. So feel free to get comfortable, get yourself a cup of coffee. We're going to start in about 2 minutes. All right, I have 2:02, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for this webinar by the Russell Sage Foundation on our program application guidelines and best practices. My name is Eric Bias. I'm a program associate with the Russell Sage Foundation. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm joined by my colleague, Deandra Durant. Deandra, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Deandra Durant. I'm the program assistant at the Russell Sage Foundation. And my acronyms are, oh, I'm sorry, not acronyms. My pronouns are she, her, hers.
And before we get started with the actual meat of the talk, I'd like to go over just a few little housekeeping notes. This meeting is being recorded, as I'm sure Zoom let you know when you came in. So if you have to leave for childcare issues or for whatever reason, feel free to come back to our website. It will be posted on YouTube after the talk. For question and answers, we're going to be using Zoom's Q&A function. The chat is open and available to you, but for questions and answers, we prefer that you use the Q&A function because it's a little bit easier for us to keep track of. I'd like to note that I'd like to ask that you please refrain from asking in your Q&As like specific project related questions during your talk. We want to try to keep this as general as possible so that it's beneficial to as many people as possible. And if you have any kind of specific questions about your project, you can just email us after the fact, and we'd be happy to set up some time to talk to you about your specific project. And also, if we don't get to your question for whatever reason, I encourage you to please reach out to us at programs@rsage.org. This email inbox is monitored by 3 people at the foundation, so we'll be sure to get in touch with you after the fact and get your question answered. So I'd like to give a little bit of history to the foundation before we start also. The foundation was established in 1907, not by Mr. Sage, but by his widow, Margaret Olivia Sage, quote, for the improvement of the social and living conditions of the US, end quote. I think it's important to note the origins of wealth in philanthropy, and Russell Sage built his fortune as a financier and railroad executive who, like many in that era, built his wealth off the exploitation of the poor and working class. I think the legacy of the man himself is more due to his wife's efforts than anything else, but that's a digression. Anyway, in the early years, RSF had its hand in supporting various efforts to reduce poverty and improve public health. If you're a resident of New York, Forest Hills Gardens in Queens was financed and built by the Foundation for Affordable Housing before the foundation sold it off and it became not so affordable. After the Depression and World War II, RSF devoted itself strictly to supporting social science research, where it has made lasting contributions to many fields, particularly with behavioral economics.
So RSF has four main funding priorities or funding areas. And something to note of these funding areas is that they are all US focused. Our mission here at RSF is to promote or to improve the social living conditions in the United States. So any type of research grant or application that we would receive, it would have to be US focused. Sometimes, on rare occasion, we do accept applications that have a comparative study with the United States, but again, it always kind of circles back to the United States as our focus, as that is the founding principle and mission of this foundation. So now I'm going to go through each one of the program areas that are listed on the screen, including their some special initiatives that we may be having. So first off, I'm going to start with the behavioral science and decision-making in context. This was formerly known as behavioral economics and decision-making and human behavior initiatives. So instead of having two of those separate categories, we decided to combine them into one main program, which is now the behavioral science and decision-making in context. So BSD&C examines the economic, social, political, and psychological decision-making processes, including looking at attitudes, behaviors, and institutional policies and practices in public and private contexts. This research could be framed in policing and criminal justice system, employment, housing, politics, racial and ethnic relations, and immigration. The next one, our next program area is future of work, which examines the causes and consequences of declining job quality in the United States, such as less and moderately educated workers, the role of changes in employer practices. I'm sure hybrid models may be a big thing going on right now. The role of labor market intermediaries like unions and growing worker power movements. Our next one is the race, ethnicity, and immigration, which has a special initiative, the immigration and immigrant integration with the Carnegie Corp of New York. And this area focuses primarily on the effects of the changing racial and ethnic composition in the United States, which could relate to the transformation of communities and ideas about what it means to be American in today's modern era. And our last main area of focus is the social, political, and economic inequality. This is also known as the inequality program because that could be a bit of a mouthful. So appreciate it. Focuses on, and this program focuses on the rising economic inequality in the United States, has effect or how it has affected various social, political, and economic institutions, and the extent to which as increased inequality has affected the equality and social mobility and intergenerational transmission of advantages. For this next funding cycle, all of these areas will be included for LOI submission. So, you don't have to worry about picking or choosing which one or waiting for the next funding cycle to apply. We will be accepting all LOIs for each of these funding areas. And we also recognize that oftentimes a lot of the projects that we will receive are they overlap quite often. So sometimes we'll receive questions like, well, my project is a little bit of future of work and race, ethnicity, immigration. Which one do I pick? That is really up to you to decide which one you feel is better suited for your project. At the end of the day, it's not that big of a it's not really affect the outcome of whether or not you receive funding. And maybe if we think that your project fits more with the FOW, future of work, than it does with REI, then we're going to switch you over to future of work. But again, that doesn't really affect the outcome of our decision. It's just kind of placing you in where we believe your project may be, or where you believe it goes. And I should also note that the website has a number of examples of research questions and LOIs that you could review to see what is exactly that we're looking for in terms of research projects and what we're looking for to see in an LOI. Yes, can you go to the next slide, please? So this next slide, we're just going over our next deadline, which is July 27th. Like I mentioned before, we are accepting applications for, or we're accepting LOIs for all subject areas and special initiatives. We should also note that we are accepting, or not necessarily accepting, some previous funding cycles. We were specifically looking for these two types of research questions, but we're not distinguishing them anymore. So the two areas that we are looking for or that we are interested in hearing about is research on non-health related outcomes of COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting recession in the United States, specifically the social, political, economic, and psychological causes and consequences on marginalized groups, as well as the research focused on systemic racial inequality and or recent mass protests in the United States, specifically on the prevalence of racial disparities in policing and criminal justice. So, as I mentioned before, in the past, we specifically had some initiatives that were looking at COVID or non-health related COVID issues or systemic racism. But these two areas we pretty much saw in all program areas. So it didn't really make sense to narrow it down so much since it overlapped quite often with really all of our funding areas. So we're not necessarily distinguishing these two research topics, but we are still very interested in receiving any type of research that we have in these areas because they're clearly affecting everything that is going on today. And we want to hear what any type of research projects that may be coming to light. Funding decisions for this round will be made at the March 2023 Board of Trustees meeting, with the earliest start date being April of 2023. If there is any extenuating circumstances that you may need to expedite the start date, that is possible. You just have to reach out to us and explain the circumstances why you need to start your start date earlier than the April 2023 date that we have given.
So we have two main tiers of funding for our LOI research grants. They have some new funding limits that went into effect for the last funding round, but I just wanted to highlight these now. So we have our trustee awards have a max of $200,000 for a 2-year project, and that includes 15% overhead, otherwise known as indirect costs. And we have a presidential grant tier, which has a max of $50,000 for a 2-year project with no allowed indirect. A major point to consider with this is that if your project is proposing data collection or salary support for multiple assistant professors, then the limit for a presidential grant can be increased to $75,000 for a 2-year grant. The submission and review process for both of these are completely the same. It's the same application. It's the same requirements. I stress this because a lot of folks have questions about the main differences between the two. The main difference is really just the budget that you're asking for and the final stage review. For trustee rewards, the final person that, or rather the final hurdle that is crossed is the grant is given a vote by the Board of Trustees during their trustee meeting. Whereas presidential grants are not given that vote, they're just voted on by the president of the foundation. So I just want to give a little bit of an overview about different stages of review for all of our LOI applications. So for a research grant, you would send in an LOI. We have 3 deadlines per year, typically in May, August, and November. Each LOI is given an internal staff review. And we basically just check to make sure that it is in line with our program areas, that it's in line with the mission of the foundation. If it passes that stage of review, then it's given an external peer review. If it passes that stage, then we would invite the applicant to submit a full proposal and also respond to comments they received during the LOI external review stage. Each full proposal will get an external peer review, and we'll also ask for the PIs to respond to the comments they received from that as well. If it is a trustee level award, it'll be given a evaluation by a standing advisory committee that's dependent on which program area it's the proposal is filed under. So for instance, we have one specifically for our inequality program, and we have one specifically for our race, ethnicity, and integration program. After that stage, it is given a final approval vote by either the Board of Trustees, depending on the grant request you're asking for, or the president himself.
So our review process includes 4 main types of reviewers that kind of show their position throughout each process or stage of the review process. So the first reviewers that review applications would be the RSF program staff, whose job it is to internally screen LOIs and assess whether they are a fit with RSF programs, priorities, and submission guidelines. So for instance, if we notice that we have a page limit of 4 pages, and someone has a page limit of, or submitted an LOI with 7 pages, then that will be disqualifying in that case, because we need to make sure that we're fairly judging everybody and that everyone has corresponded with the guidelines that were presented. And something I should note as well is that research or references, tables, graphs, those type of things is not included in the page count. So feel free to add your references and graphs without worrying about whether or not this is going to make your LOI go over the page limit. So once we screen out those applications, it moves on to external reviewers. And these external reviewers are generally a mix of econ, psychology, or economists, psychologists, political scientists, sociologists. It's a very mixed group of scholars and specialists, and it's very interdisciplinary. We make sure to have a very diverse group because we want to make sure that, again, that we are providing as fair of judgment in the reviewing process. And these reviewers are specifically chosen for their knowledge on the topic and the methodology. So there is a lot of discussion about, well, is this person have the qualification to or the knowledge to review this type of LOI that's been submitted. And we're very conscientious about that and trying to pair the right scholar with the right LOI so that there is a fair judgment given. So again, those external reviewers would review both at the LOI stage and at the proposal stage. Sometimes you may get the same reviewer review your LOI from the LOI stage to the proposal. So it's really important that you also, if you are invited to go to the proposal stage, and they have suggestions for you, directly respond to what their suggestions are, because, that would show that you're listening to their advice, and, and that you care about their advice. So once you get through the LOI stage, goes to the proposal, gets reviewed again by external reviewers. And then after that stage, it goes to the advisory committees. And again, these are standing committees of interdisciplinary experts recruited by program area. Typically, the advisory committees are standing for 1 year, and then they could either renew, or we find new committee members. But these are all, again, scholars and experts in their field. Most of them have had long history with RSF as well. And they come together as a group to kind of discuss the proposals and as a group, and make decisions on which ones to move forward for consideration of funding. And then the final reviewers would be the Board of Trustees. And the Board of Trustees makes all final decisions on proposals that are $75,000 and more. Anything less than that is considered basically a presidential grant, and would be decided on by the president of the Brussels Sage Foundation. There's also online on our website, there is a list of our current Board of Trustees, so you can see who exactly these board members are. And yeah, so try and be as transparent as possible through this review process.
Before continuing, I just want to circle back a bit and jump on one thing to avoid any kind of potential confusion. The special areas that we focused on, or that we highlighted before, around the effects of COVID and racial inequality, that's not something that we are specifically looking for. It's just something that in the past couple of rounds, actually, we had focused on more than others for obvious reasons. None of these things are going away anytime soon. So actually, in the future, we're rolling those into our RFPs for future rounds. So they're just not going to be as called out as they would be before, or they have been before, rather.
So what do we ask our reviewers? During the proposal stage, there are 5 main questions that we ask our reviewers to look at when they are reviewing proposals. The first question is, are the main questions important and compelling? Are the questions hypothesis clearly stated and appropriately supported in terms of prior theory and empirical work? The next question, are the proposed research design, data, and methods appropriate to address the questions raised? Is there sufficient power to make causal claim? Do the qualifications of the investigators suggest the capacity to carry out the project? What is the likely contribution of the project? Will it sufficiently advance the literature? And do you have anything else to add that would help strengthen or improve the project? So these are the main questions that are asked at the proposal stage, and we ask our reviewers to give as much detail as possible. And you would also be able to review these when they are completed as well. You can go on to the next slide.
So if you are declined at the initial screening, your LOI may fall under a few categories that we highlight. One being, it's, quote, not an RSF funding priority, end quote. And what this means in practice is that your project may not be focused on the US, or your outcomes are not necessarily a priority for us, a research priority. We're usually looking for projects that aren't doing any kind of routine analysis of existing publicly available data set like the PSID or the CPS. And what routine analysis means is that basically you're just doing some regressions or something like that. I should also note that we're not necessarily restricting that you not use these data sets. For instance, if you wanted to use the CPS but link it with data that you collected on your own or with another data set that's not necessarily publicly available, that's something we would totally accept as well. But if you're doing some kind of project that's just looking at these and solely looking at these, then that's something we would probably pass on. Again, we're not really focused on funding operational support for nonprofits. We don't necessarily do program evaluations, and we don't do studies on animals or health studies on humans for that matter. And we don't fund projects on health outcomes or issues that are around educational curricula. And that last point is mostly because there are other larger foundations, like in terms of educational curricula, Spencer, that has much higher amounts of funds that we do that focus on these topics better than we do. Another point that you may receive if you're getting declined at the initial screen is your project is, quote, too preliminary. What we usually consider to be too preliminary is that you don't have a pilot study conducted, or you're just proposing some data collection, but you haven't necessarily got a plan beyond that. In practice, we typically fund a lot of projects that are focused on data analysis after data has been collected, after a pilot has been completed, after there are some kind of results that suggest that there is a definite direction as to where your research is going. And in fact, if you happen to want to propose something like that, like a pilot study, for instance, we have a pipeline grants program for early career scholars that is geared specifically for that kind of research. Other particular reasons might be your LOI could be not necessarily as clearly written as it could be, or there could be some strong design flaws in the LOI itself. We stress data and methods in everything that we look at. In fact, those are probably the main criteria that we use for any kind of evaluation of a particular project. So if those aren't necessarily up to snuff, it's probably not going to make it past the initial screen. If your LOI is not well written, if there's a lot of typos, or it's not, or if there's a lot of jargon, for instance, if it's too short, if it's too long, then it'll probably not get past the initial screen. Each LOI is 4 pages, not including references or figures or anything like that. So we really encourage you to maximize that space as much as possible. Don't go too far under and don't go too far over, otherwise it'll probably get rejected. And lastly, RSF prioritizes research projects with strong descriptive or causal designs. And by that, I would like you to be very consistent with what you're trying to do with your project. If you're doing, say, a descriptive project, make sure that your language is descriptive in nature. Make sure that it does not use, for instance, causal language in that, and it gets that kind of, it gets that objective confused. Like if you're making a causal claim, keep your language causal in design and vice versa, essentially. And we'll get into the pipeline grants later on. Actually, right now. So we have a whole bunch of other funding mechanisms in addition to our regular LOI programs. Today, actually, we have a deadline for visiting scholars. Which are actually just fellows that come and stay with us in our office and bounce their ideas for research off of other scholars and residents. It's usually geared for scholars that are 3 years post a PhD. In addition to that, we also have visiting researchers, which are essentially the same as visiting scholars, but they aren't funded. And we also have some visiting journalists that come in that are for journalists who are doing work that is kind of social science adjacent. Their work would generally benefit from being around a solid cohort of social scientists as well. We have a new program for PhD students who are late stage in their studies, basically ABD, called the Dissertation Research Grants Program. This is strictly for PhD students that are enrolled at a US-based university, and it would grant up to $10,000 for students to do data collection, have participant expenses, and even $5,000 for a stipend they can use for whatever they want. The next deadline for that would be February 1st. Going down the list, we also have a journal, the RSF Journal of the Social Sciences. This is an open access, interdisciplinary, topic-based, and peer-reviewed journal that is available for everyone to see on our website. And we actively solicit proposals for this for topic-related journal issues. You can find specific information for that on our website as well. We have a pipeline grants competition, again, for postdocs, early career scholars, generally adjunct and tenure track assistant professors. It would give you a one-year grant of up to $30,000 per project with a mentorship component and the chance to present your work at a capstone conference in the following year. That would be completely on us. You wouldn't have to pay for any kind of travel expenses or hotel expenses or anything like that. The next deadline for that would be November 2nd. And we also maintain a number of summer institutes for early career scholars and PhD students. And these can be around a whole host of different topics like migration research methods, proposal development, and biological approaches to social science. And those deadlines are usually in the spring. They tend to vary by specific institute. And again, you can find all of these different mechanisms and deadlines on our website. I would recommend that you look at our website first and foremost for any kind of deadline information. Often a problem is someone sees a deadline on a different website and then applies to us and it's either late or way too early. I would definitely recommend that if you have any kind of deadline related question, you look at our website first, because chances are that outside website will probably be wrong.
So some tips for and tips and suggestions for the submission of LOIs. Again, make sure that the projects fit with the foundation's funding priorities. I just got a question about whether or not we would accept applications that would relate to healthcare. Again, unfortunately, we would not fund those type of projects. We wouldn't be able to fund health outcome related projects or education outcome related projects either, including like I forget the top of my head, but the reason why we wouldn't do that is because there are other foundations that are better funded that are specifically designed to do those types of research. So unfortunately, no, we wouldn't be able to fund that. But again, make sure that your projects are aligned with our current funding priorities, which could all be found on the website, along with examples of LOIs. The question drives the proposal, so it's very important that you map out the research design, data methods to your research question, balance out the proposal narrative. So, you have very limited space, especially in the LOI stage, where you can present your topic and your research. So we asked you to refrain from, talking a lot about your qualifications. Not that we don't want to hear it, nor that it's not important. It's just that we want to make sure that, for one, you're giving better light to your research topic, and also that should speak for itself in the CV that you submit. And just for clarification, at the LOI stage, the main PI should be the one submitting their CV if invited for the proposal. If you have any co-PIs, then you would submit their CVs as well. provide sufficient information for reviewers to evaluate appropriateness of methods. So again, that the methodology, the research design is fairly critical, and that's something that we want to examine very closely. Don't overpromise or exaggerate what the project will do. So for example, don't use causal language if you don't have a causal design. Show understanding of strengths and limitations of design methods and analysis. If asked, respond to reviewers seriously, graciously, and in depth. This could really make or break an application or really a decision to fund an LOI or proposal. You know, because it really does demonstrate that you are listening to other people's interpretation or suggestions, and you know, even if you disagree with their advice, well, give a reason why, but don't flat out ignore them. You know, respond to them in a gracious manner, and also show that you do care. Check out our website for example LOIs and proposals, as well as for the guidelines and the deadlines, and submit on time. I'm not sure if everyone in the room currently has an active account with us already, but if you have not registered, we advise that you register for at least 48 hours before the deadline. Oftentimes we will see our registration get flooded with new registration links. And you know, it's up to us to push through those registrations. So, and it could get lost in the shuffle. So I would suggest that at the very least, 48 hours, if not 5 days prior to the submission deadline. That way we have the time to push through your registration, and then you can submit your application. But be very conscientious about that deadline as well. And we received many more good proposals that we could fund. So, you know, if this is your first time applying and you don't get it, it's not unheard of for somebody to apply again and get funding. So keep trying, and you know, use that feedback that you receive throughout the review process to your advantage. You could go on to the next slide. So for the next one, some basic budget guidelines. So first off, the full budget is not needed at the LOI stage. Just a brief description, even just a couple sentences that say, you know, I'm going to use X amount of dollars for this reason. At the LOI stage, really all you need is the LOI, your CV, and that's about it. You know, again, if you have some graphs and tables, those can be added that without, you know, interference with the going over the page limit. But the LOI stage, we want to make it as simple as possible. So just the budget just the LOI and your CV of the PI. PIs with salary of up to $250 or $250,000 may request summer salary support of up to $25,000 for a 1-year grant and up to $50,000 for a 2-year grant. Course buyouts are considered on a case-by-case basis and allowed for pipeline grants. Student research assistance is allowed, but tuition costs are not covered. So we can cover the salary of a student researcher, but we will not cover the tuition cost of that worker. Crowdsourced workers, you know, such as through MTurk, may be paid minimum wage or $15 an hour, whichever is higher. Travel dissemination for conferences are not allowed for non-pipeline grantees. However, if you have any travel-related data collection, that will be built into your grant. So that's really the only time that we would cover travel costs is if you need to travel for data collection purposes, and that will be built into the grant. So should be provided that should be provided in your budget guidelines as well as your full proposal. And if you want to find out more, the link is found here for further details.
All right, thank you, everybody. Again, I'd like to stress that if you have any questions that we don't get to during this webinar, please just email us at programs@rsf.org. And I guess now we'll go over some of the questions that we received in the chat and the Q&A box. Someone is asking in the chat, are paid non-student research assistants considered acceptable expenses? For example, a part-time study coordinator? It depends. There's more than one way to get support for, like, for instance, a staff researcher in our budget guidelines. You can have them as a consultant. You can have them as like a staff administrator. It really just depends on what you're going to use them for your project. I would either reach out to us separately for more details or take a deeper look at our budget guidelines page, which has a bit more detail on what we've outlined here. Someone else is asking if there's going to be a webinar for our pipeline grants program. There isn't going to be a specific webinar for it, but for the next version of this webinar, which we're going to give in October, we'll go into far more detail about the upcoming deadline for the pipeline grants project or program in November. So I guess the answer to that is somewhat, maybe, yes, more or less. Someone else is also asking if there are other options for funding if the project is in the making and it will be a pilot project. In that kind of case, I would recommend that you apply for a presidential award, which would be the one that is $50K max for 2 years and $75K max if you're doing data collection, which I guess that would be for a pilot project. And we usually recommend that tier of funding for folks that are proposing something like a pilot project or for folks that have not applied to us in the past. And the main reason for that being is that the hurdle for getting funding from us is just a little bit lower. Like, reviews and the review process actually is admittedly pretty rigorous for us. So it's just one less hurdle to jump over to possibly get that level of funding. And another question someone has is, to what degree does RSF prioritize co-creation or co-production with users and or policymakers, or otherwise engagement of users or community members in research? I guess the best answer for that would be it depends. We try to find, or actually we try to fund innovative uses of data, innovative uses of research. I would probably have to know more about the specifics of the project for me to give a definitive answer. So I would recommend that you just email us maybe like a one-pager or something to programs, and I can give it a look and maybe give you a clearer answer that way.
Also, as just an added thing about the budget guidelines, so if you're collecting data and or have salary support for co-PIs, you may request $75,000 for presidential grants. Typically, presidential grants are $50,000 and less, but in those circumstances, you may request $75,000 and less.
And if no one has any other questions, oh wait, where can we locate the recording for this webinar? Someone is asking. Shortly after this is over, we're going to host it on YouTube. I would stay tuned. It'll be hosted on our website. It'll be hosted through YouTube. So give us a few days and maybe check back shortly.
I'm also going to drop in the chat a link to our grant writing resources, which can be found on our website. So you could feel free to look at that. And I also see a question from Jessica. When might we expect to hear back about our LOI? Are you referring to the LOIs that were submitted? Well, if you submit an LOI on May 4th, you should be hearing back soon. If you are planning to submit a LOI on July 27th, and correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but they should hear an update about their LOI by maybe the mid to late August.
Something like that. Generally, we try to let people know the status of their LOIs a month before the proposal deadline for that same funding round. So I'm kind of blanking on it right now because I don't have access to my screens because it's all webinar. But if you go to our website and look for the proposal deadline for this particular funding cycle that we're giving a webinar on, go back a month, you should know what we should let you know right around that.
Yeah, I'm just about to drop that deadline, the deadlines for that in the chat, so you should see that now.
If no one has any other questions, wait.
All right, I'm gonna try and drop those links again. Should be for everybody. My apologies for the technical issues, but the link I'm dropping now is for the application deadlines. And the next one will be the writing resources. And the next one is funding priorities. So we have a lot of information on our websites. So just feel free to take a look at that, especially the guidelines and deadline things. And if you have any further questions, we're very much available at that email. As Eric mentioned earlier, there's 3 of us on that email. One of us is going to get back to you.
We try to pride ourselves in being as transparent as possible with our practices and workflows. So if it's not on a website, let us know. We'll try to put it up there. But if no one else has any questions, again, thank you all for attending this webinar. And I hope you have a good rest of your week and a good afternoon. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.